Who the Hell Is brings you our new Biography Bites, compact biographies of the world's greatest thinkers. Each biography is taken from the first section of one of our Who the Hell Is books. So once you've listened to this and had a taster of who the hell this great thinker is, why not find out what the hell they were on about? Our books are available at whothehellis.co.uk. The life story of Olympe de Gouges. There is a rich history of political, ideological and social movements driven by women to secure equal rights, but the fight began long before 19th century first wave feminism. Described invariably as an activist, a humanist, a stateswoman, a political analyst, a playwright and a femme philosophe, Olympe de Gouges was all these things, but above all she was a champion of human rights. In her short lifetime she wrote more than 60 political works and 15 socially conscious plays, demonstrating her strong belief in the power of the word as a weapon against discrimination in all its forms. De Gouges was writing at a time when women were considered second-class citizens, and the French Revolution's reign of terror made it incredibly dangerous to speak out against the status quo. Refusing to be silenced, she fought tirelessly for women's rights, including the right to divorce and laws to protect women and their children from impoverishment. She argued passionately against slavery, the fanaticism and power of the Catholic Church, and the death penalty. Olympe de Gouges began life as Marie Gouges, born on 7th of May 1748 in Montauban, France. But her story begins before this day with the close friendship between her mother's family, the Muisset, and the Lefranc, an esteemed family of nobles. Jacques Muisset, Marie's grandfather, was a master cloth shearer and also a lawyer. It was common in those days to have more than one profession. He also took on the role as tutor for the Lefranc's firstborn son, Jean-Jacques, the future Lefranc de Pompignan, while his wife, Marie's grandmother, became the wet nurse of their second-born, Jean-Georges, born the same year as Marie's mother, Anne Olympe. Naturally, the children of both families became close. When Anne Olympe was baptised, the 5-year-old Jean-Jacques was named as her godfather, and as they grew older, they became much closer. Despite the links between the two families, this growing love match was frowned upon, as marriage was often closely tied to social class, and this was clearly a mismatch. So Jean-Jacques was sent to Paris. This decision, made by the Lefranc, was to have resounding repercussions, not only on Jean-Jacques and Anne Olympe, but on the future Olympe de Gouges as well. While studying law in the capital, Jean-Jacques pursued his passion for the theatre, which very quickly took over. In 1734, having lived in Paris for only 2 months, he completed his first play, Didon, which was to make his name as a playwright. Meanwhile, back in Montauban, Anne Olympe was married to someone of her own social class, a 21-year-old called Pierre Gouze, who had inherited his father's butchery business. According to the 18th century historian Jacques-Antoine Dulot, who had known Olympe de Gouges in the early 1780s, the marriage was arranged by Jean-Jacques himself in order to protect Anne Olympe from any scandal that had arisen from their passionate affair before his exile to Paris, despite the pain the marriage caused him. Anne Olympe and Pierre had 4 children together, although the legitimacy of one, a daughter, would forever be in question. On returning to Montauban, Jean-Jacques and Anne Olympe continued their affair, while her husband Pierre was away on business. A little over a year later, Marie, the future Olympe de Gouges, was born. It appears to have been common knowledge in Montauban that Marie was Jean-Jacques' daughter. Poncet Delpech, deputy of the Estates Générales, spoke of Lefranc's paternity as fact, and de Gouges herself spoke of spending a lot of time as a child with Jean-Jacques, whom she called Papa, and who, she said, openly referred to her as his daughter. By all accounts, she bore a striking resemblance to him, and, as later became evident, was to inherit his love of and talent for the theatre. Marie was described as being a lively child, curious, sensitive and romantic, but above all she had a strong sense of justice. She often quoted historical French heroes, in particular the Chevalier de Bayard, a knight without fear and beyond reproach. Her favourite pastime was to have passionate conversations with friends, and even adults, with whom she could certainly hold her own. Pierre Gouze died at the young age of 33, when Marie was only 2 years old. Jean-Jacques repeatedly asked Anne Olympe to let him take over the legal guardianship of Marie, but she continually refused. This was to cause the final rupture to their relationship, of which Marie would become the victim. When Marie was 5 years old, Anne Olympe remarried in an attempt to finally put a stop to the gossip. Jean-Jacques returned to Paris heartbroken, confiding in his friend Thierry, "My life is a tissue of afflictions, the harshest of treatment by my family, and affairs of the heart more cruel than you could imagine." This heartbreak would later turn to bitterness to the cost of both Olympe and Marie. Montauban, the capital of the south, was one of the most deeply affected by the 16th century Reformation, and therefore suffered greatly from the aggressive counter-Reformation by the Catholics, who set about restoring old institutions and establishing many more. In their desire to rid the population of their Protestant heresy, and after the initial expulsions of the Protestant population from the city, the Catholic Church began its quest to re-educate the people of Montauban, setting up religious educational institutions in the process. From then until 1785, all young girls from good society were educated by the Ursulines, a congregation of women teaching Christian doctrine, which included learning to read, write and sew. It is thought likely that Marie received a rudimentary education with the Ursuline in Montauban, for she certainly wasn't illiterate. As is evident in her writings, de Gouges would always be embarrassed of her poor handwriting. She was, however, far from alone. A large majority of her contemporaries were illiterate, and even a good number of writers were known to have a poor hand. In that era, knowing how to write was like knowing how to touch type in more recent times. It was an activity that was considered subordinate and that one would give to a secretary to do. Later, in Paris, Olympe de Gouges was known to always dictate her work to secretaries, so she was therefore like any other woman of her time, no more, no less. In the Languedoc, the culture was very much an oral one, that of the Occitan, which has continued up to the present day. Marie frequently spoke Occitan, at least up until her marriage, as French was considered to be a written language and failed to establish itself as a familiar body of expression. Growing up with a different language and only a basic education, de Gouges would go on to achieve a great deal in order to overcome her shortcomings. Mastering another language and learning to express herself correctly, inspired by the example of her natural father, she triumphed over the obstacles that might otherwise have thwarted her plans and literary ambitions. With both fathers gone, and her sister Jeanne having moved to Paris with her husband, little Marie grew up with her new stepfather, Dominique Raymond Cassegnot, a new police recruit, along with Olympe and her remaining siblings. As Marie got older, she became a great beauty and attracted much attention, not just for being the illegitimate daughter of Lafrance. When she was 16 years old, her mother and stepfather began looking for a husband for her. Mary Lafont, a writer from the region, recalls the memories of her grandmother. One evening in the new theatre in Montauban, Lafrant's Didon was playing, and anyone of note was there to honour their famous playwright's work. Everyone was dressed up in wigs, with feathers, velvet, gold, embroidery and diamonds in excess. But according to Mary Lafont, it was Olympe and her daughter Marie who attracted all the attention that night, describing them as the ideal perfection of beauty in the midi. It was here that Marie's future husband, Louis-Yves Aubry, first saw her and became captivated by her. He was from a middle-class family from Paris, but his job as a chef to the Count Alexis de Gouges had taken him to Montauban in 1761. In this position he would have been considered a good match for Marie. She, however, did not feel the same way. Nonetheless, they were married in October 1765, when Marie was 17 years old. De Gouges later wrote in her autobiography, "I was married to a man whom I did not love, and who was neither rich nor well born. I was sacrificed for no reason that could sway the repugnance I had for this man. They refused, I do not know why, to give me to a man of quality who wanted to marry me. If I had been able to follow my taste, my life would have been less varied, and the only romance would have been the circumstances of my birth." It seems likely that the man she mentions is a young man from Montauban called Valette, the protégé and whipping boy of Voltaire, and the subject of Voltaire's poem Le Pauvre Diable. Marie was known to have spent a lot of time with him, sharing his love for literature and the theatre. From de Gouges' words above, however, she became philosophical about her fate, realising that she wouldn't have achieved all that she did had she married for love. Aubry wasn't a particularly kind man, and although nothing is known of what Marie suffered in her marriage, she would always have bitter memories of her time spent with him. Less than a year after their marriage, Marie gave birth to a son on 29th of August 1766, whom she named Pierre. She was an attentive mother who never left his side. In the middle of November of that same year, huge floods caused untold damage to Montauban, destroying at least 1,500 houses and leading to numerous deaths, either from drowning or from the fever that spread through the city afterwards. Whether or not he was one of these victims, it is not known for sure, but Aubry died shortly after the floods, and Marie became a widow. Free from a marriage which had been forced upon her, Marie refused to keep the name Aubry. By all accounts, her marriage had been such an unhappy experience that she vowed never to marry again, and did indeed remain single for the rest of her life. For Marie, marriage represented the entombment of love and trust. It was around this time that Marie began to call herself Olympe de Gouges. This pseudonym, despite appearances, was not so very different from her real name. Olympe came from her mother, for whom she held much affection, and in fact it was common at that time for women to call themselves by another first name of their choice. Gouges is perhaps a derivative of her family name Gouges. In that era, family names were not fixed and would vary in their spelling. However, another explanation has been suggested by her biographer, Sophie Musset, who says that Gouges in Occitan was an offensive term used for lowly women accused of bawdiness and meant a soldier's slut. It is possible, then, that Marie thought this particular derivative of her name was a bit of a joke, particularly as she would go on to have a long affair with a member of the French Navy. As for her use of the preposition de, this was commonly used by women in the South to denote where they were from, and which in Paris had the advantage of closing the gap between the social classes. It was also common at that time for many among the middle class who owned land to insert de between the name of their property and their surname as a way of distinguishing members of the same family from one another. In 1767, due to the war in Corsica, there were many soldiers garrisoned in Montauban. Jacques Beatrix de Rosières, who was waiting to obtain a place in the navy, was put in command of organising the troops by his father, who was head of military transport. Beatrix met de Gouges around this time and they became lovers, and he her protector. Although their relationship was to endure, she would never agree to marry him. However, despite her unwillingness to commit to him, Beatrix would support de Gouges financially for years. It has been estimated that he spent around 70,000 livres on her during their relationship, which is around 500,000 euros in today's money, including paying a pension for her mother, Anne Olympe, who became widowed once again in 1770. In 1773, Beatrix was appointed first naval clerk at Versailles. He had also inherited the Royal Military Transport Company, which had been created by his father. De Gouges and her son Pierre accompanied him to Paris, where he was to take up his new position and where she would pursue her dream to become a playwright. Once in Paris, de Gouges found an apartment in Rue des Saussayes before settling in a house in Rue des Marais, where the French dramatist Jean Racine had once lodged. Writing plays was an occupation that women were largely excluded from at that time, since by law they needed their husband's permission to be published. This is perhaps another reason that de Gouges vowed never to remarry, since widowhood gave her a degree of freedom in the literary world. During this period of her life, she became dedicated to constantly reinventing herself, striving for acceptance from high society in a bid to establish herself as a respected member of their circle. She made it known that she was the daughter of the Marquis Lefranc de Pompignan, a respected and educated man of letters, which would have added intrigue to her literary legacy and validated her work. To further her writing career, de Gouges succeeded in infiltrating influential circles within Paris, making connections with philosophers, writers, and members of the aristocracy, no doubt with the help of Beatrix. Amongst those who were instrumental in helping her to realise her aspirations were the Duke Louis-Philippe Joseph de Chartres and the writers Louis-Sébastien Mercier and Michel de Cubières, the latter two of whom would remain her closest friends. Despite her relationship with Beatrix, she indulged in affairs, which was highly fashionable at the time. Although she would not let anyone boast of his conquest, who had not actually conquered her, she once caused a Marquis de Chabillon to admit the truth on his knees before an entire salon. Not long after leaving Montauban for the last time, Jean-Jacques Lefranc married a wealthy widow with whom he had a son, Jean-Georges Louis-Marie. In 1778, de Gouges finally met her half-brother, and for a while they became close, until she meddled in one of his love affairs, which was to cause an irreversible break in their relationship, a split actively encouraged by his mother. De Gouges was in written contact with her father, but it was seen that over the years he had become a hardened religious fanatic along with his brother, who had risen through the ranks of the Catholic Church to become Archbishop of Vienne. Neither wanted to openly acknowledge de Gouges as a member of their family. When Anne Olympe fell into destitution, de Gouges wrote to her father asking him and his brother for help, but both refused. In his response to de Gouges, Jean-Jacques said, "If you truly believe I am your father, then do as I do and moan for the fate that was bestowed upon those who brought you into this world." His words suggest a bitterness derived from his being denied a life with Anne Olympe and their daughter. Their very last contact was to be equally unpleasant. Upon hearing that de Gouges was frequenting the Paris salons as the daughter of a famous writer, Lefranc wrote to her for the last time, saying, "Unfortunately for me, I admit that you are no stranger to me, but that doesn't give you the right to claim that I am your father." her friends encouraged her to solicit the support of Voltaire, who not only had a great influence within de Gouges' circle, but disliked Lafond immensely. De Gouges, however, tactfully refused, saying, "I came into this world under the legitimacy of marriage. If the Marquis is my father, I will not prove who I am, so that I may reap the benefits by way of his enemy. If he is not my father, then I have no rights to his paternity anyway." At that she contacted him no more, hoping that upon his death he would leave her mother a small sum. Alas, he did not, and neither did his wife or brother, who upon Lafond's death reneged on promises they had made her and humiliated her by sending a single gold coin. Incensed, de Gouges determined to reveal the appalling way she and her mother had been treated by writing her autobiography, The Memoirs of Madame de Valmont, as a roman à clef, a novel based on fact but overlaid with a facade of fiction. This was a clever way for her to reveal the truth about people with the power to get her imprisoned for slander, which likely would have happened had she used their real names. Despite everything, throughout her short life, de Gouges was proud to be the daughter of a famous, talented man. She never had any doubt about her origins or where her writing talent came from, and she constantly made reference to her illegitimate birth. Between 1780 and 1784, de Gouges set up her own amateur theatre troupe while attending classes at the lycée. Sharing her passion for the theatre, de Gouges would take her son Pierre along, where he would happily play amongst the actors. She wrote her first plays, Amour and Misère, or The Fortunate Shipwreck, for the theatre in 1784, which would finally be performed in 1789. This was followed by Cherubin's Lovers, which had been inspired by Beaumarchais' The Marriage of Figaro. Alas, the play was never shown due to Beaumarchais' animosity towards de Gouges, whom he accused of plagiarising his work. However, in 1786, de Gouges finally succeeded in getting the play shown by altering the storyline slightly and renaming it The Unexpected Marriage of Cherubin. The play was highly praised, earning a glowing review by literary critic La Harpe in Le Mercure de France, who described it as showing talent, spirit, and imagination. In the spring of 1786, de Gouges took her private theatre troupe on a tour of the provincial academies, showing her 5-act play The Generous Man, which again was well received and welcomed by the Countess of Genlis in the new Duke of Orléans circle, but rejected by the Théâtre Français. The following year, de Gouges disbanded her private theatre, selling off the sets and costumes, concentrating on writing more plays, and becoming increasingly political and philosophical with her pamphlets. She targeted the shoddy treatment of the common people by the government, the horrors of the Civil War, the need for social reform, women's role in society, and the abolition of slavery. Before the Revolution broke out in 1789, the Comédie Française was a place where new writers could have a shot at showcasing their work to the aristocracy. Founded in 1680 and still in existence today, this was the go-to French theatre that housed the plays of some of the world's most renowned actors and writers, including Molière. It was here that Olympe de Gouges attempted to make her debut as a playwright with Zemmour and Meurza, also known as Black Slavery. This was a play about black slaves helping a French family shipwrecked on an island, and it condemned slavery and colonialism, subject matters largely unheard of and rarely openly discussed. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, French colonies enslaved black people from Africa and the Caribbean, which de Gouges consistently and strongly opposed. The theatre accepted several dozen plays per year, but between its reorganisation in 1761 and the Revolution of 1789, it accepted only 9 plays by female writers, de Gouges being one of them. She came to prominence by using her connection with de Chartres, allowing him to submit the play on her behalf. By demonstrating that she was no stranger to elite social circles, she increased her chances of the play being considered for performance. However, even writers who had their work accepted by the acting troupe had difficulty getting their play performed. It was expected that writers spend at least a year consorting with the actors and their lawyers before waiting their turn to put on their play. During this time, de Gouges sent several polite letters to the lead actors, asking them to perform her play, before meeting them in person with de Chartres as her escort. The interactions between de Gouges and the acting troupe through letters took place over several years. When the troupe finally met with de Gouges after her many letters, she had an outburst, angrily demanding that they consider her play for performance. She was impatient with their lack of communication and their dismissal of her letters. Such behaviour was unheard of from a woman, and resulted in the immediate rejection of her play from the troupe's list. They then wrote to the Minister of the Royal Household to request her arrest. With the intervention of the Duc de Richelieu, and by writing a series of conciliatory letters, she was able to reconcile with the troupe, eventually getting her play performed in 1789 and 1790. In 1789, riots were in full force throughout France, and the revolution had begun. De Gouges' lover, Beatrix, lost his contract with the royal administration, which left him in serious financial difficulties. Since Beatrix was de Gouges' main benefactor, this was to have serious repercussions for her lifestyle. As the civil unrest grew, de Gouges continued to write her political publications, but also used her plays as a way to get across her political messages. She threw herself into political confrontations, joining the Society for Friends of the Blacks, proposing the creation of a female-only national theatre, even moving to Versailles to attend the assembly of the Estates Générales. During this time, through the Duc d'Orléans, de Gouges was able to obtain a position for her son Pierre in the military, where with his mother's connections he would go on to rise quickly through the ranks. In a series of her writings at this time, de Gouges pleaded with the Estates Générales to put aside their differences and concentrate on the catastrophe hitting France and its citizens. She begged for the king and the Estates Générales to join ranks and create a constitution. In one of her most complex texts, Royal Session, written in 1789, in which she sets out to justify her previous assertions, while at the same time to placate those she had offended, de Gouges essentially wrote a speech to the nation, as though from the king himself, telling them that he would abdicate in favour of a regent. She attempted to put her text into the king's own hands, but was refused entry to the palace. It was this equal support of the monarchy and the nation that was to be de Gouges' downfall, when she was later accused of being a monarchist. During the first year of the Revolution, the Third Estate took control, storming the Bastille in July, passing a Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in August, witnessing the Women's March on Versailles in October, and finally abolishing feudalism, along with all the taxes and privileges that constituted the old regime. With the king forced back to Paris, de Gouges moved to the village of Auteuil, now a neighbourhood in the 16th arrondissement of Paris. It is incredible to think that during this violent upheaval, as involved as she was, de Gouges wrote constantly and prolifically in the form of philosophical essays, plays, political publications, letters, and numerous articles. She even continued to put on plays. In 1791, in response to the king accepting the new constitution, inspired by the Declaration of the Rights of Man, de Gouges wrote her own version, Declaration of the Rights of Woman and Citizen. It was this text that she would become most famous for. The following year, 1792, de Gouges was still based in Auteuil, but now living in a tiny apartment on Rue Saint-Honoré, just a few steps away from the National Assembly and the Jacobin Club, where Robespierre and Brissot, two of the leading figures in the revolution, although not of the same faction, would engage in verbal combat. At the young age of 26, de Gouges' son Pierre was made captain, and in the same year his wife gave birth to their first child. While Pierre was comfortably off thanks to his wife's inheritance, his mother was falling more and more into debt. In March that year she was sent a summons by her creditors, and the same month her sister Jeanne died from heart failure. However, de Gouges was not one to be discouraged, and she continued her fight against injustice and her pursuit of a peaceful solution to the revolution. Throughout 1792 she wrote posters, pamphlets and political publications demanding liberty and equality for all, exclaiming against the violence used to bring about change, remonstrating against the various political parties and their corruption, greed and lust for power. She wrote several pieces attacking Robespierre and others defending the king, even approaching the assembly to offer to defend him in his trial, and producing posters exclaiming Olympe de Gouges, official defender of Louis Capet, and plastering them on the walls all over Paris. In all her works she showed fair-mindedness, understanding, shrewdness and pacifism, but succeeded only in making powerful enemies. In December of that year she was attacked in the street, and finally took the decision to abandon her political fight, writing My Last Word to My Dear Friends. On 17th of January 1793, Louis Capet, the King of France, was condemned to death. Mortified by the outcome of the trial, de Gouges made what would prove to be a fatal decision to continue fighting for justice. Taking up her pen once again, she wrote, It would be better to discuss a treaty with the enemy powers, and buy with this culpable head a peace that favours us, and that will spare the blood of all peoples. De Gouges was considered by her enemies to be a royalist, but in reality she was simply against all forms of violence, prejudice and injustice. One of her final pieces, Three Governments Battle to the Death, written in the last year of her life, called for a democratic government, chosen by the people, where no one would be put to death just for holding opposing views to the government. But with the Girondins and Montagnards more divided than ever, de Gouges was entering extremely dangerous territory with her pacifist views. On 26th of January, Beatrix gave her the sum of 18,600 livres to balance her accounts, and in the spring she moved from her tiny apartment in Auteuil to what would be her final place of residence, Rue de Harlay, between the Palace of Justice and the Place Dauphine. In May, her son, Pierre, was wounded in battle, and fearing his death, de Gouges visited his wife and son in Touraine, arranging to buy a cottage nearby as a retreat from the unrest in Paris, with part of the money given to her by Beatrix. She finalised the purchase on 1st of July, and on her return to Paris 12 days later, published The Combat as a poster entitled The Three Urns, All the Welfare of the Motherland. A week later, she was arrested. It was de Gouges' sense of equality that was to be her undoing. While she supported many elements of the revolution, she did not favour the monarchy being abolished entirely, instead supporting a constitutional monarchy, whereby the king or queen rule alongside a government, rather than having absolute rule. As the National Convention was set on destroying the monarchy in its entirety, de Gouges' pamphlets, alluding to the establishment of a new monarchy, were considered an act of insurrection, following the decree passed on 29th of March, banishing any texts attempting to establish a new monarchy. De Gouges would certainly have been aware of this decree, but either she was naive about the consequences of her actions, or she was willing to risk her life for what she believed in. It seems more likely to be the latter, although she was genuinely shocked by her arrest, believing herself to be a patriot to the Republic and a supporter of the revolution. If there was any element of naivety to her actions, it was perhaps more that she believed that justice would prevail, as was shown when she voluntarily accompanied the police to her home when they requested that she hand over her work. She truly believed that her innocence would be evident when they read through her plays, pamphlets and posters, but stumbling upon her unfinished play, France Preserved, or The Tyrant Dethroned, they took it as evidence of her treachery. The play centres around a dramatic confrontation between Olympe de Gouges and the monarchy, specifically Marie Antoinette, on the eve of the insurrection of 10th of August 1792, whereby the Tuileries Palace, where King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette resided, was attacked by the National Guard of the Paris Commune. It was on this evening that the monarchy collapsed. The play is set in the royal bedchambers, and Marie Antoinette is depicted defending the monarchy. Undertones of revolution are reinforced by the portrayal of the king and dauphin as weak and useless. This play and her political poster, The Three Urns, would eventually be used against de Gouges at her trial and result in the order of her execution. At her trial she was entitled to a defence lawyer by law, but was refused one by the court, who claimed that, since she had been representing herself politically in her pamphlets and plays, she was well equipped to defend herself. Such discrimination was perhaps a result of a patriarchal society resenting the radical political views of a woman they felt unable to control, or else the outcome had been decided before the trial even began. The prosecutor at de Gouges' trial interpreted her play as giving political agency to Marie Antoinette and the monarchy, and claimed that de Gouges was guilty of having maliciously and purposefully composed writings attacking the sovereignty of the people. He stated that she had defied the core beliefs of the revolution, and that her play's representation of the Queen, a figure viewed by the radical revolutionaries as a monster, was unjustifiable. On 2nd of November, she was condemned to death. Fighting right up to the end of her life, de Gouges wrote several pamphlets, smuggling them out of prison to be published. They detailed the horrors of her captivity and challenged her enemies, but to no avail. On 3rd of November, 1793, in the afternoon, Olympe de Gouges was guillotined. She was 45 years old. According to an anonymous witness, never had we seen so much courage together with so much beauty. After her execution, a crowd of restless women assembled in front of the Paris Commune to protest against the abolition of the Society of Revolutionary Republican Women. The president of the Commune, Pierre Gaspard Chaumette, appeared before them and made a speech that firmly condemned the efforts of women engaging in men's affairs. He reminded them that their place was in the home with their families, and their duty was to tend to them, and especially their husbands, when they returned home after a long day at work. Respectable women, Chaumette said, didn't talk about policy in cafes or societies. And to enforce his point, he continued, "Remember the impudent Olympe de Gouges, who was the first to set up women's societies, who abandoned the cares of her household to get mixed up in the Republic, and whose head fell beneath the avenging knife of the laws." De Gouges' son Pierre publicly renounced his mother shortly after her sentencing, no doubt forced to do so in order to protect himself and his family. Nevertheless, he was suspended from his position as Deputy General, As soon as Robespierre fell from position, Pierre went before the Assembly and asked for his mother's good name to be reinstated, at the same time changing his name to Pierre Olympe de Gouges. He was granted his request, but in order to regain his rank in the military, he had to first retract his mother's ideals and beliefs, which he did willingly. De Gouges' best friend, Fanny de Beauharnais, never forgave him. Sent to French Guiana by the military in 1802, he arrived with his wife and their 5 children in Cayenne. Several months later he died of a fever at the age of just 36. The last known descendants of Olympe de Gouges have been located in America, Tasmania, and Australia. If you've enjoyed finding out about Olympe de Gouges' life and want to learn more, then check out Who the Hell is Olympe de Gouges by Mina Moriarty to find out what influenced de Gouges' thinking and how this remarkable woman reimagined a world with justice and equality for all. The book looks at her declaration of the rights of woman, her fight against the church and its stance on marriage and divorce, and her fight for the abolition of slavery, all written in an accessible, engaging and jargon-free way. Visit whothehellis.co.uk today.